Okay, good morning, everybody. Safety 1051, confined space lecture for today. All right. Just before we start, what do we have here? Just a little picture explaining things. It's a bit of a pre-word to the text that we're going to analyze in the next slide. This would be some sort of a hopper. Right? Hopper is a device, well, a huge device to sort or load grains. For example, in this case, it's loading grains, so there will be a huge containers here with some outlets over at the bottom, and the grains are coming over there. There will be a little bit of a catwalk, and catwalk is this right here, this walking area there with some railings, of course, because it's on heights. And that's where people can, or the workers can walk and do whatever work they need to do there. All right. So here is a hopper. Here's a catwalk on top of the hopper. Okay. So let's look at a certain case study. Okay. Here's the case study. While workers were unloading sand from a cement mixing hopper, the material became stuck and stopped dumping on from the container. So this will be the container, and this grains or whatever the material would be just coming out of this outlet right there, loading onto whatever maybe looks like a huge conveyor belt or whatever. So something stopped loading, something got stuck, so somebody came there and started investigating what's going on. Right, a worker walked along the nearby catwalk with a 7-foot pole, intending to dislodge the sand. Okay, so it was a sand thing. Okay, once the worker was near the hopper, he was out of view of the other employees. The top of the hopper was open, and while there was no designated entry point, the hopper was accessible from the catwalk. Okay. At some point, the worker entered the hopper because no one could see him. No one knows whether he accidentally slipped or if he entered the hopper voluntarily. When the sand became dislodged, the man became moving again. Co-workers saw the 7-foot pole. Okay, hold on. When the sand became dislodged and began moving again, co-workers saw the 7-foot pole fall out of the bottom of the hopper with the sand. They were unable to locate the worker on site and realized he must have fallen into the hopper. Eventually, rescuers extracted the worker from the bottom of the hopper and administered CPR, but unfortunately, he succumbed to his injuries a short time later. So that would be a fatality, a fatal accident, right? So here's the case study that we're opening up this lecture. Take away, the worker entered the hopper without a confined space plan and without proper training. The open hopper should have been guarded or sealed to prevent unauthorized or accidental entry. A simple grate or barricade over the hopper could have prevented his death. All right. Excuse me. So then we're entering the topic of confined space. What's a confined space? A confined space is a space that, and sometimes I read things, you know me by now. A confined space is a space that is large enough for a person to enter and work. Is the first condition. Has limited or restricted means of entry and exit. And here's the key. It is not designed for continuous occupancy. Again, confined space is space that is large enough for a person to enter and work. has limited or restricted means of entry and exit, and it's not designed for continuous occupancy. Here's Ontario regulation defines the confined space. As confined space means a fully or partially enclosed space. So you're looking at the legal documents here. And here's two conditions, here are two conditions. So confined space means a fully or partially enclosed space, A, that is not both designed and constructed for continuous human occupancy, and B, in which atmospheric hazards might occur because of its construction, its location, or contents, or because of work that has to be done in it. All right, so here we have the definitions. Now, let's look at something that's called a permit required confined space. So first, we got the confined space in general. Then there's something that's called a permit required confined space. A permit required confined space has at least one of the following characteristics. It contains or has the potential to contain hazardous atmosphere, which, well, atmosphere is, well, the air that we breathe in. Okay. Contains a material that has the potential to engulf an entrant. What's engulfing? Well, if somebody drowns, they are engulfed in water. If somebody, well, drowns in sand, then the person would be engulfed by sand or grain or so. So here's the engulfing thing, all right? Also, it has internal configuration. We're going to analyze some of those situations, such that an entrant can be trapped or asphyxiated. Oh, basically can no longer breathe. Or contains any other recognized serious safety and health hazard. Right, so here's a definition for permit required confined space. Yeah, we do a lot of reading today, right? What is an entry permit system? Well, an entry permit system is an administrative tool used to document the completion of a hazard assessment for each confined space entry. Things are serious. Someone fully trained and experienced in confined space work would complete the entry permit. It's not just anybody, right? You have to have a training to complete that. Some jurisdictions require a permit for all confined space entries. So depending on where you are, you should be familiar with the local laws, rules, and regulations. An entry permit is required for confined spaces where the hazard and risk assessment determines the measures to control the risk involve the following. Again, an entry permit required space, sorry, an entry permit is required for confined spaces where the hazard and the risk assessment determines the measures to control the risk, and it involves the following. It concerns atmospheric monitoring, isolation, isolated from the outside environment, lockout, ventilation, safeguarding devices, respiratory protection, or any other control that requires, that's required, that should be, by the risk assessment to be verified by a permit. So what are we considering when we are filling out or considering the permit, entry permit? We should consider the atmospheric monitoring, which means constantly monitor the air. We'll go into details. Isolation. The entry or the whole work confined space should be isolated so nobody can get in without proper training or anything else that involves the entry. Before here's more text. Okay, before entering a confined space, an entry permit should be completed. It should contain at least the following information. This is one of those lectures here. Those texts will stop soon. Okay, don't worry about it. Right, again, before entering a confined space, an entry permit should be completed. It should contain at least the following information. So that's the minimum. Right? The length and time for the permit is valid for. So you can't just get a blank statement that says, you can, here's a confined space and you can enter and work at it any time because here's the permit, right? It's not like a driver's license. You can drive your car anytime you want. The name or the names of the workers that are authorized to enter the confined space. The name and or the names of the attendants. Safety watch or supervisor. I'm not sure how many of you have watched what's the reality show that was there. I wasn't watching it that much, but sometimes it was on TV, so I would look at it. It was something like gold diggers or something like that, that people would go and search for gold in Alaska or maybe some under. There was one series of that involved people diving underwater. So there will be a diver looking for the gold on the bottom of the whatever sea, ocean, or lake, or whatever it was. And on top of that, there will be a person as an attendant, constantly talking to that person that's on the bottom and monitoring the safety and the overall situation, right? So that would be attendant, right? Example of an attendant, right? What else should be considered in the entry permit? The location and the description of the confined space. The scope of work should be specified. The scope of work that is to be done in the confined space. Possible hazards that might be encountered inside and outside the space. Hazards. Remember what's the difference between risk and hazard? Hazard is the type of danger, what can happen to you, and the risk is the assessment of what is the possibility statistically for that to happen. Is the high risk of whatever is going to happen, or is the low risk? Yeah. So the dangers, the possible dangers that can be encountered, possible hazards that might develop during the work activity, the date and time, okay, of entry into the confined space, and the anticipated time of exit. The details of the atmospheric testing done of the confined space, when, where, results, date monitoring, monitoring equipment was last calibrated. Ideally, calibration would be done just before the use for the atmospheric monitoring equipment. If it is not possible, follow the equipment and manufacturer's guidelines for the frequency of calibration. Things are being spelled out here, aren't they? Hazard control measures, including the use of mechanical ventilation and other protective equipment needed, and any other precautions that will be followed by the worker who is going to enter the confined space. Some years ago, I was working for a company that would do installations, data infrastructure installations, and the company got a contract with Shell gas stations. And because it's a gas station, it would be sort of considered as a confined space. The work that we had to do is we would have to walk into the, well, something that looks like a variety store, into the store where anybody can walk in. Somebody who wants to go and get a bag of chips or buy a lottery ticket, they could walk in there, no problem. It's a store. Right? What we had to do is we had to enter that store, go to the back, replace the modem that was there with the newer model and get out. So it was nothing different than a client walking in from off the street. But because we had to work, things are so serious, being taken so seriously, that because it was a gas station, we had to be trained in a confined space specific to whatever the situation was. That's how things are serious. It costed us money to complete that, and the training was like 4 hours online course. Okay. What also should be, we're talking about what should be involved in completing the entry permit. Means of communication between, so it has to be specified how people are going to communicate. So means of communication between the persons working in the confined space and the attendants, which are outside the confined space. Then what should be specified? Emergency plan and the protective equipment and emergency equipment to be used by any person who takes part in the rescue or response to other emergency situations in the confined space. A signature of a worker who did the confined space air testing. A signature on the permit would indicate the adequate precautions are being taken to control the anticipated hazards. Authorization signature by the supervisor certifying that the space has been properly evaluated, prepared, and it is safe for entry and work. All right. So that's the minimum that the work permit, the entry permit should include. The entry permit should be posted at the confined space and remain so until the work is completed. The employer should keep a copy of the complete permit on file. Still talking about confined space. All right, and here's the definitions. Once you download the file, you'll be able to have that. And definitions, just as I said, hazard. What is hazard? Something that can cause harm. For example, toxic gases. A risk, a chance of the hazard will cause the harm. Example, a high or low risk of asphyxiation. Let's look at the confined space hazards. In a confined space, because keep that in mind, the confined space is a space that you can enter and work at, but it's not designed for continuous occupancy. So you can't, it's not designed for you to work like somebody's office is designed for continuous occupancy. You can go there and work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Confined space is a space that you have to enter sometimes, and it is not designed for you to just basically work there all the time. So what are the hazards of confined space? Well, oxygen deficiency, that will be the atmospheric. thing, right? Flammable or combustible gases and vapors. There was sometime in the 90s, beginning of 90s, there was local news that a couple of workers had to enter something that's confined space in London, in our city, that some possible atmospheric hazards would occur. And the gases, the toxic gases, were so strong that it overwhelmed the workers upon opening the doorway to that. And whatever it was, they pretty much were asphyxiated instantly, fell into whatever the confined space was, and it was pretty much instant death. Right? So things are being serious. And mind you, if you are not sure of some possible dangers, if somebody sends you on a service call, for example, and you find yourself in front of something that you would recognize as possible confined space, please refuse the work, make a phone call, tell them what is that. They will not get mad at you. They would rather reschedule the work and do the complete paperwork. It would cost them less aggravations and less emotional stress and less everything else than buying the flowers for your funeral. All right, what can be done? Toxic gases, engulfment. So these are hazards, dangers, things that can harm you. Engulfment in solid or liquid. Well, you can drown in some sort of a liquid that looks like water, but maybe it's not. Or you could be engulfed or overwhelmed by grains or sand or whatnot, other materials. High noise levels. This is also a hazard. Grinding, crushing, or mixing mechanisms. This will be part of the configuration of the um, description of the thing that would classify the space as a confined space. Right? So these two kind of get together. Extreme temperatures, chemicals, and lack of lighting. So these will be confined space hazards. All right. What do we have here as far as, excuse me, confined space? Here are some examples. There's a silo. What's inside the silo? This thing is filled with grain right here. If somebody enters, if somebody falls in, they could be engulfed in the grains. This is the possible configuration of what's inside something like a silo, all right? This person can be engulfed or overwhelmed by whatever the, well, it looks like sand and other debris. So in both cases here, you're talking about the hazard of, well, engulfment would be the main thing, right? Over here, here is a room with some sort of moving machinery and whatnot running. So this would be a space that is not designed for continuous occupancy. Maybe once in a while, you just have to go and adjust something and check for something and whatnot. And this would be the example of the configuration, which means the arrangement of things that are inside, excuse me, that could possibly pose a hazard to your health or well-being. And here are the references if you want to click on things. You can find out more about this. All right. Now here is an interesting thing. You see this reserve pit here is surrounded by is guarded by a fence. The reason for that is, let's just see what that says. This reserve pit is a permit required confined space because of its potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere and to drown a worker. So at first you would see, okay, what can happen here? Well, somebody can fall in and drown. That's the first thing that comes to our mind. But no, you have to consider other things. Whatever that thing is here doesn't necessarily have to be pure water. It could be some sort of chemicals that if you come close to that, you can be overwhelmed by the chemicals, by the vapors, and then you can fall in. Or even if you don't fall in, you can still die because of the vapors that are in close proximity of that pit. So yes, this would be considered a permit required confined space because it contains any of that here. All right, next slide. Here's an example of a permit required confined space. Again, there's an entry. Of course, definitely, this is not a space that would be classified as a continuous occupancy space. There's an entry here that a worker can get in and out, but it's a limited entry. There are many hazards there. There could be lighting, there could be high noise level, there could be some atmospheric lack of oxygen and whatnot. All right, so this would also be classified as a permit required confined space. And on the bottom it says, always follow your company's permit procedures, even if you are going in there for just a second. This is how most of the accidents happen. I was just going to poke my head in there. Okay, well, there's a reason why things are being spelled out in this way. And unfortunately, the reasons is because something happened to someone in the past. This is a confined space. This confined space might be oxygen deficient or contain flammable, combustible, or toxic gases or vapors. And on the bottom, it says, test the atmosphere in this order: oxygen content, then flammables, then toxic and other hazards. By no means, by just listening or participating in this lecture, by no means that makes you a qualified person to enter, monitor, or do anything with the confined space. I just want you to know that something like that exists, and if you are going to work or you're going to be asked to work in anything that could be classified as a confined space, I want you to recognize the hazards. I want you to recognize the signs of something being possibly considered as a confined space. Because for whatever company you're working, the person who sends you for a service call, they might not know that you, once you enter the building, oh, whoops, yeah, you're going to be dealing with a confined space. Are you going to have situations like that? Uh, I would say yes. As an example, I had few examples over the 30 years plus that I used to work in service industry doing installations and service calls. Yes, I had situations like that, and well, I've seen people just going in there. Yeah, let's just do that. I never would. I would always make a phone call. Say, look, this is not good. Once we were sent to make a little connection for excuse me for a telephone wire. But what we had to do is we had to go and crawl underneath a swimming pool area. Under the swimming pool, there are spaces that you can walk in there. The problem was that as soon as I entered that room that led to the space underneath the swimming pool, it was a huge Olympic swimming pool size. I was overwhelmed by the smell of chlorine. Well, here's the atmospheric hazard. And was there any ventilation? No. And the closer you would get under the space, the crawl space underneath the swimming pool, the smell of the chlorine was so overwhelming that I could actually almost feel my lungs being burnt by just inhaling that. I wouldn't walk in there. I just made a phone call to the office. I said, look, you haven't considered, maybe you didn't know, but it's not a good idea to walk in there because of so and so. Nobody would get upset with me. They were glad that I called, because if I just walked in there and something happened to me, trust me, they would also be responsible. They would have to go through all kinds of questions by all kinds of lawyers. So they were also glad that I recognized that space in such way, and I made them aware of that. All right. This slide shows what? It says test the atmosphere at all levels of the confined space. Good air near the opening doesn't mean that there's a good air inside, like for example, on the bottom of the whatever the confined space is, which would be the example of what just that I just gave you. And the example that I gave you was an example from, well, it's a real life, was a real life example, and the confined space was not recognized before I was sent there, simply because people didn't know. After I made a phone call, they knew, and proper procedures were followed. This is just a little example of the atmospheric or the air tester. Not sure how many years ago this was presented, but right now, every year new technology is being developed. The testers might look a little bit different, and if you are going to use such device, uh, you are going to be properly trained on things like that with details, right? Once you download this presentation, I would encourage you to click on this link here, which describes the confined space air monitoring and the introduction to the air sampling. So just watch these two videos. There might be some questions on the test, on the last test, that have to do with these, right? Atmospheric pressure, the atmosphere inside a confined space might not be suitable for entry. In this case, all kinds of other procedures would kick in. Like, for example, forced air ventilation might be used, but you are not permitted to enter until the atmosphere is suitable. So if, here's an example that, sometimes you can see, five managers positioned around one person who digs a hole with a shovel, right? Which would be like grotesque kind of a situation, but you see it all the time. In this case, there's one person or maybe two people are going to be working in there. Maybe they're going in there for 10 minutes, maybe they're five, maybe for 1 minute. But look, there's all kinds of crew personnel that make sure that all the what needs to be done is done properly, and the objective is whatever comes in, has to come out. So 3 people go in, 3 people come out safe and sound. Atmospheric conditions might change while you are in a confined space. Just because you have tested that things are okay now doesn't mean that things can't change. They can change within a confined space. Get out. All right. If hazardous atmosphere is detected while worker is in the confined space, what should happen? All activities should stop. The worker or workers should exit immediately. Unfortunately, there could be situations that when things change, the worker who is there has to be pulled out instead of walking on their own. The hazard should be evaluated. Protective measures should be taken. If a worker must wear a respirator, remember that air purifying respirator will not do anything if the oxygen is deficient in the space. So basically, a respirator or a mask that will do a wonderful job if somebody is doing the sanding of a drywall, just so the dust doesn't get into the breathing ways, but there is an oxygen in the room. That same mask will not do anything if there's no oxygen to breathe. So things have to make sense and appropriate equipment should be used. Adequate illumination should be provided where the lighting is limited. In some cases, explosion-proof lighting might be necessary. What's an explosion-proof lighting? Explosion-proof lighting would be that all the devices are enclosed in such way that if there are some flammable gases in the confined space, turning things on and off and whatever the way the equipment works, there could be tiny bit of sparks when you are turning the light on or off in your kitchen. Sometimes if you do it too slow, move the switch too slow, you're going to sense some sort of a sparking there. Well, if there is a gas leak in your house, immediately your house becomes a confined space. Do not turn lights on and off because there's always a little tiny spark when you press the switch, right? On and off. If you do that and there's a gas in the air, things can go, as they say, south pretty quickly, right? All right. This is 8:45. We're going to stop here with the first half of this confined space, I might say lecture. We're going to continue that next week with this. And then one more topic we have is the arc flash. On this Friday that's coming, I'm going to introduce you to the assignment that you're going to perform, and it has to do with a three-way switch. But for now, we're going to stop right here. Okay. I also want to remind you that in this course, all labs have to be completed and evaluated, which means that if you have done all the labs except one, I'm not allowed to give you a passing grade. It's an automatic thing. It's not up to me. So make sure that if you don't have some lab completed, talk to me or send me an email, join another class, but let me know, right? So I can get ready for you, or we with Ms. Hashemi as well. So we can get ready for you if we need to get set some sort of equipment for you on the side so you can complete that lab. Let us know that that you want to perform some sort of labs. Do not miss that. Time is running out. Okay. All right. So these are the after class sort of announcements here. Cool. All right. You got 15 minutes to get to your next class. Don't get too depressed about this this lecture that we have just done. All right. Cool. All right. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful week. And you know, always it's almost Friday, even though it's Monday. Bye guys.